"Get out, you're not invited," Derek said, standing in the doorway of the house I'd owned outright for 11 years, blocking my path with one arm braced against the frame while snow settled quietly on my shoulders and my grandchildren's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere inside, and I stood there on my own front porch, 72 years old, holding a casserole dish and a bag of wrapped presents, absorbing the specific, disorienting shock of being told I couldn't enter a home whose deed sat, at that exact moment, in a fireproof box in my own bedroom 2 miles away. My name is Harold Whitfield, I'm 72 years old, and the house Derek was standing in that Christmas Eve belongs to me, purchased outright 11 years ago with money from my late wife Susan's life insurance policy after she died of a heart attack, a 4-bedroom colonial I bought specifically so my daughter Claire, then newly married and struggling financially, would have somewhere stable and comfortable to raise the family she and Derek were planning. I structured the arrangement carefully with my attorney at the time, allowing Claire and Derek to live there rent-free in exchange for covering the property taxes and basic maintenance, while I retained full ownership, a decision I made deliberately rather than simply gifting them the deed outright, partly for tax reasons my attorney recommended and partly, if I'm honest with myself now, because some instinct I couldn't fully articulate at the time told me it would be wise to maintain that particular safety net. Claire and Derek married 12 years ago, and I want to be fair in saying Derek seemed, in those early years, like a genuinely decent match for my daughter, attentive, hard-working, quick to help with anything around the house whenever I visited. The shift happened gradually enough that I spent years explaining it away rather than confronting it directly, small changes at first, Derek gently discouraging Claire from taking a part-time job she'd been excited about, Derek managing all the household finances himself even after Claire mentioned wanting more involvement, Derek's opinion somehow always becoming the deciding factor in decisions that used to be conversations between equal partners. By the time my first grandchild, Lily, was born 8 years ago, I'd started noticing something else entirely, a specific narrowing in how often Claire and I actually spoke without Derek present. Phone calls that used to run long and easy now cut noticeably short whenever I heard his voice in the background, visits that grew progressively shorter and more supervised, as though Derek needed to be present for any real interaction between his wife and her own father. I remember one particular afternoon, Lily still an infant, when Claire called me sounding genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, telling me about some small milestone, and then, mid-sentence, going suddenly quiet, telling me she needed to go, that Derek was home, in a tone that made the ordinary fact of her own husband walking through the door sound almost like an alarm being raised. I raised concerns gently, more than once, always met with Claire's quick reassurance that everything was fine, that Derek just liked being involved, a reassurance I wanted badly to believe and therefore, for years, mostly did, telling myself I was simply an overprotective father struggling to accept that my daughter's marriage looked different from what I might have chosen for her myself. The isolation deepened considerably after my second grandchild, Noah, was born 5 years ago. Family gatherings that had once included me as a natural, expected presence started requiring what felt increasingly like formal permission, Derek deciding which holidays I'd be included in, which milestones I'd be told about in advance versus after the fact, a pattern so gradual that by the time I fully recognized its shape, years had already passed and Claire's own voice in these decisions had grown correspondingly quieter each year, as though some essential part of her agency within her own marriage had been slowly, deliberately, worn down. I want to explain why I never simply asserted my ownership of that house directly during those years, because looking back now, it seems like an obvious tool I could have used far earlier than I did. But I understood, even then, that reclaiming the house outright, evicting my own daughter's family from a home I'd deliberately given them stability in, would have been a nuclear option that likely would have ended my relationship with Claire and my grandchildren entirely, handing Derek exactly the narrative he'd probably have wanted, that I was a controlling, interfering father-in-law who couldn't respect boundaries, rather than the more complicated truth I was slowly watching unfold instead. I had also convinced myself, for longer than was probably wise, that any real problem would eventually surface clearly enough that Claire herself would ask for help, not realizing that the entire design of what was happening was built specifically to prevent that clarity from ever fully forming in the first place. That Christmas Eve, I'd been told, 3 days earlier, by Claire herself, sounding strained on a call I could tell she was making from somewhere private, that I was welcome to come by for a couple of hours in the early evening, before the main family celebration with Derek's parents began later that night. I arrived at the specified time, casserole and presents in hand, genuinely looking forward to seeing my grandchildren after nearly 6 weeks without any real visit, and found Derek standing in the doorway instead of Claire, informing me, before I'd even finished climbing the porch steps, that plans had changed and that my visit wasn't going to work after all. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly had changed, and Derek's explanation shifted uncomfortably as I pressed, first claiming the children were overtired and needed rest, then, when I pointed out I could hear them very much awake and playing just inside, shifting to a vaguer explanation about needing family time that apparently no longer included me, delivered with a tone that made unmistakably clear this wasn't really about scheduling logistics at all, it was about Derek exercising a specific, deliberate authority over who was permitted inside a house he had, somewhere along the way, apparently come to consider entirely his own domain to control. "Get out, you're not invited," he said, finally, when I didn't simply turn around and leave the way I think he expected me to, and something in me, standing there in the cold with snow settling on a casserole dish I'd spent that morning carefully preparing, finally, completely, stopped bending in the specific way I'd been bending for years in the name of preserving peace with my daughter's marriage. "Derek," I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "I understand you believe you have the authority to decide who enters this house. But I own this house. I have owned it for 11 years. And I think it's time we all had a considerably more honest conversation about that fact than we've apparently been having." I watched something shift across his face, confusion first, then a flicker of something closer to genuine alarm, the particular alarm of a man realizing, in real time, that a foundational assumption he'd built years of behavior around might not actually hold the weight he'd been putting on it. Claire appeared in the doorway behind him then, drawn by the sound of our voices, and I watched her face move through several emotions in quick succession, confusion, embarrassment, and then, underneath both of those, something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a person who's been waiting a long time for someone else to finally say the thing she hadn't found the words or the courage to say herself. I want to be honest that what happened next wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect, no shouting match, no immediate eviction notice served on the spot. I simply told Derek and Claire both, standing there in the doorway with snow still falling, that I would be having my attorney send over the original property documents in the new year, that I intended to have a serious conversation with both of them about the terms under which they continued living in a house I owned, and that going forward, I expected to be treated, in my own property, with the same basic respect and access to my daughter and grandchildren that any reasonable family arrangement would include. I didn't wait for a response. I set the casserole dish down just inside the door, told Claire I loved her and the children very much, and walked back to my car, leaving Derek standing in a doorway that had, for the first time in years, stopped belonging entirely to him. The weeks that followed involved considerably more conversation than confrontation, my attorney formally notifying Derek and Claire of the property's actual ownership structure, a fact I later learned Derek had genuinely never fully understood, having apparently assumed, based on assumptions he'd never actually verified, that the house had been gifted outright to Claire and him years earlier rather than remaining legally mine the entire time. That misunderstanding, once corrected, seemed to shift something in the entire dynamic, Derek's control over the household finances and family access suddenly considerably harder to maintain once the fundamental premise underlying it, that this was unambiguously his domain, no longer held up under actual legal scrutiny. Claire and I had our first truly honest conversation in years about 3 weeks after that Christmas Eve, sitting in a coffee shop without Derek present, a meeting she'd arranged herself for the first time in longer than either of us could easily remember. She told me, haltingly at first and then with growing clarity, about years of feeling slowly managed within her own marriage, decisions made for her rather than with her, a narrowing of her own independence she'd talked herself into believing was simply the natural compromise of marriage rather than something considerably more deliberate. She described, at one point, the specific exhaustion of constantly calculating which requests were worth the argument they might provoke, a mental math she'd apparently been running for years without ever quite naming it to herself as anything other than ordinary marital compromise. She told me that watching me stand in that doorway and refuse to simply absorb Derek's dismissal the way I always had before had been the first time in years she'd seen anyone, including herself, successfully push back against the specific authority Derek had quietly built around himself. Claire and Derek are in couples counseling now, a decision Claire made largely on her own initiative in the months since that Christmas, and I've made a point of not inserting myself too deeply into whatever that process reveals or resolves, believing, as I always have, that the actual repair work in a marriage belongs to the two people inside it rather than to a father-in-law, however directly affected by its dysfunction. What I have insisted on, without negotiation, is regular, unsupervised time with my grandchildren and my daughter, conversations that no longer require anyone's permission to happen, a boundary I hold now with a firmness I wish I'd found the courage to establish years earlier, before an entire decade of gradual erosion had taken root in a house I'd built specifically to give my daughter stability rather than confinement. I think often, driving past that house on ordinary weekday errands, about how close I came to simply accepting Derek's version of who belonged where within walls I'd paid for with my late wife's life insurance, believing I was preserving peace when I was actually, slowly, teaching everyone involved, including myself, that my presence in my own daughter's life was something requiring someone else's permission to grant. Lily asked me a few weeks ago, with the particular directness only an 8-year-old can manage, why I hadn't been at their house as much when she was little, and I found myself choosing my words carefully, telling her only that grown-ups sometimes take longer than they should to understand what they're allowed to ask for, hoping she was still young enough that the fuller truth could wait a few more years to be told properly. That Christmas Eve cost me a casserole dish left cooling just inside a doorway and an evening with my grandchildren I didn't get to have, but it gave me back something I'd been quietly losing for years without fully realizing it, a daughter who finally understood she was allowed to want more than the narrow, managed version of family life she'd slowly convinced herself was simply how marriage worked. I don't know yet what Claire and Derek's marriage ultimately becomes, whether counseling repairs what years of quiet control wore down or simply makes clearer, for both of them, that some foundations need more than repair work to hold real weight again. But I know that whatever happens next, my daughter will make that decision herself, with her father fully present in her life again rather than standing outside a doorway in the snow, waiting for someone else's permission to matter.